Okay, today we're going to be taking a look at the contemporary perspectives or approaches to psychology stemming from the cognitive revolution in the 1960s as a result of the United States really focusing on education and the sciences and the maths. We see the development of what is called cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology focuses on how we think, we perceive, how we learn, how we develop memory, how we communicate and solve problems. Also, part of this is cognitive neuroscience. And really, this is what emerged out of the study of education in the post World War II, is studying the brain and its activity and how it's intertwined with our cognition and perceiving things and our memory and thinking as well. Helping us understand what psychology is. We talked a little bit about this yesterday. It's a scientific study of our behavior as well as our mental processes. Obviously, we're focusing on humans, but as you have found out in the first mod, we understand the animals, which understand humans as well. So, how is psychology scientific? Well, one of the things we learned yesterday through empiricism, and as we'll learn in Unit 2, the scientific method, we use to critically evaluate evidence, and therefore, psychology is scientific. So, what is behavior? Consisting of anything that is observable and therefore we can measure, allows us to understand our behavior. So, anything a person or an animal does is referred to as behavior. Mental processing consists of anything internally in our subjective experiences that we infer from our behavior is referred to as mental processing. So things like sensations, perceptions, our dreams, for example, our thoughts, our beliefs, and our feelings are considered a mental process. And I'm sure you're going to be wanting to know what your dreams mean. We'll talk about that when we get to that unit. The biggest question in psychology you will find is it nature or is it nurture? Is our genetics or is it our experiences that cause our behavior and our mental processing? As you'll find out, it is both nature and nurture. They interact together to help us process and behave. So, do our humans' traits develop through experiences or are we born with them? Well, if you go back to Socrates and Plato, they believed that we were born with it, it was innate. Aristotle and John Locke believed that our life was based on our experiences. If you remember, John Locke came up with this tabula rasa, this blank slate that we are born with. So, what is nature and what is nurture referring to? Okay. Behaviors and mental process occur because they are inborn and innate as nature. Nurture is anything that we experience in our life is nurture. So, parenting, for example, leads to nurturing. That's why we talk about a parent being a good nurturer. By the way, is your mom or a dad a better nurturer? That's a question we'll talk about much later. So, who came up with this nature and nurture? Obviously, as we talked about in the first mod, we look at Charles Darwin and his book called The Origin of Species. He talked about traits and behaviors that provide survival that are naturally selected. So, what that means is those traits that help us survive get passed on. Those do not are become dormant. And that's what naturally selected means. And basically, that's what he refers to as evolution. So what best helps us understand nature and nurture? It is twin studies. Twins, identical twins, share 100% of the same genes. Fraternal twins share about 50% of the same genes. So these identical twin studies really help us understand, is it nature or nurture? Because when they are separated, we're able to see whether or not it's the nature that causes them to be similar, or is it the nurture that causes them to be dissimilar. But do we take twins and separate them at birth purely for study purposes? Is that ethical? That's another thing we'll talk about much later. So what is it about natural selection that psychologists explore? How humans are alike and diverse? Are gender differences genetic or socially constructed? Grammar is innate or is it formed through our experiences? How is intelligence influenced? Is sexual behavior pushed by biology or pulled by experiences and incentives? Are disorders through the brain or through thoughts, or are they both? Can depression be both biological and psychological? All right, let's talk a little bit about culture and how much culture plays a fact. How does, for example, culture we are form impact kissing? In cultures where languages are read left to right, about 2/3 of the couples lean their heads to the right when kissing. Think about that for a second. 77% of the Hebrews and Arabic language speakers who read right to left kiss when tilting their heads to the left. Really interesting as we take a look at it. So as we take a look at a very steamy issue in our society is gender. Gender is constructed through roles and characteristics by which our culture defines as being male and female. Okay. Gender differences, how emotions are expressed and detected. What do we actually dream? Are there certain psychological disorders that go along linked to genders? So there are more similarities between men and women, and there are greater differences within the genders. That's a really interesting thing that we'll talk about much later. One of the things we'll talk about at a later date as well is this idea of positive psychology. This really is a contemporary perspective that how humans flourish. The goal is discovering and promoting our human strengths and virtues. This goes along with the humanistic approach that we are looking for the good in everybody. Uh, we're looking at the strength in communities that individuals have as well. And again, we're looking at what is the positive. And this is a positive approach. You think about overcoming obstacles in our life. Are we going to think more positively or are we going to think negatively about it? All this, these kind of things always happen to us. Are we more likely to succeed in things when we think positively or negatively? Think about that for a second. This is all part of the idea of positive psychology. All right, let's talk about the biopsychosocial approach. Remember, we talked about how psychology is more eclectic. Well, this is the idea that our biological, psychological, and social approaches all work together in understanding our behavior and our mental processes. How we analyze together the contributions of each of those perspectives. The contemporary perspective is useful, but one of the things that happens is it fails to explain the whole picture. Learning from psychological research changes us as we come to understand what it is that we are studying. So, a couple other new perspectives here are the behavioral approach, how we learn and observe behaviors impact in mental processing. By watching other people, for example, does that influence the way that we think and behave? Things like modeling. and those kind of things, reinforcements, etc. The biological perspective is another contemporary perspective that focuses on our genetics, our neural pathways, our hormonal influences, and the psychological process of impacting behavior and mental processes. One of the things that we'll talk about with the behavioral approach is this idea of conditioning. If you've ever heard of Pavlov and Pavlov's dog study, that is one that we're going to study and how we are conditioned. Think about when the bell goes off at school. What do? You get up and leave, right? That is a conditioned response. That comes from the behavioral perspective. The cognitive perspective, the rules that we follow, use to view the world, are important to us understanding why we think and behave the way that we do. It is the interpretations of situations, the mental processes, focusing on problem solving, our memories and our thoughts, and then how that impacts our behavior and mental processes. Another one is the evolutionary perspective, how natural selection of traits has promoted the survival of our genes, which we alluded to earlier. It explains and examines human thoughts and actions in terms of natural selection. Traits that benefit us are passed on. I'm sorry, the humanistic perspective. And again, this gets back to that positive psychology, the drive for our personal growth, being all that we can be. One of the things we'll talk about with this is a guy by the name of Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, where we are trying to self-actualize, and that is be our best self. And what steps do we have to take in order to self-actualize, and how that impacts our behavior. There's also the psychodynamic perspective of how our unconscious drives and conflicts impact our behavior and mental processing. It is less concerned with Freud's sexual influences of psychoanalysis, which he advocated. It focused more on our childhood relationships, and how those affect our normal adult behavior. Things like how well did we get along with our parents, and was there neglect and everything like that early in childhood, which could possibly affect us later in life. How much does our culture affect the way that we think and act? That would be studied through the social cultural perspective, how it varies across situations and culture. Just because we do things in the United States a certain way doesn't mean in other cultures that is true. So we'll analyze how that varies from one culture to another. All right, that concludes our lecture for Mod 2. We'll talk about this tomorrow.